And we have liftoff. Welcome, everyone, to the first live stream panel discussion we've got lined up for you this year. I'm your host, Akshay Anand. I'm the product ambassador for ITIL, and we have an amazing cast here with us today to discuss some things which are very core to what we do as IT service management professionals. The title of this live stream, this panel discussion, is A Problem by Any Other Name. And it was spurred by an interesting discussion thread on a social media group called Back to ITSM over on Facebook, which talked about what we would do with things like near misses or faults or outages that happened temporarily outside of normal service hours and so on. It was a very interesting thread, and we thought we'd get some people together to be able to discuss that. So joining me today, in no particular order, but I'll start with Phyllis Drucker, who is Miss ITSM, MS ITSM over on Twitter. Phyllis is a senior consultant in IT service management as well as enterprise service management with Cognizant Technology Services based out of Florida. Not sure which part of Florida, Phyllis, but given your background, I'm going to guess Miami.
Well, pretty close, Fort Lauderdale.
There you go. She's also the outgoing chair of ITSM International, and I'd also like to give a small plug to Service Management Days, which is coming up at the end of this month, which is a global IT service management virtual IT service management conference that's being hosted by ITSM International, and Phyllis has been working really hard in the background getting that whole thing organized. So for that, I'd like to thank you, Phyllis, and I'd like to invite people to register and attend some of the talks. You never know what you might learn.
Thank you.
Joining Phyllis is Stuart Rance, who is should hopefully be a familiar face or a familiar name. Back in the day when we used to go to real life conferences, Stuart was very recognizable from his very colorful outfits. And I can see here that he's got his yellow shirt and his green tie on. I'm not sure what happened to the green jacket, but maybe that'll make an appearance later on. But Stuart is an independent consultant and service management advisor at Optimal Service Management. He can be found on Twitter at Stuart Rance, that's STUARTRANCE. He's also been involved with ITIL all the way from version 2. If I remember correctly, you authored some significant components of ITIL version 3, and of course you've been involved with ITIL 4 since its inception, since our early days as part of the, when we got the lead architecture team together to start to work out what ITIL 4 needed to do and say, and it's been a lot of fun working with Stuart over the years.
I've enjoyed it, actually.
And last but certainly not least is James Finister, who is the practice partner at TCS Tata Consulting Group and their enterprise agility practice. His camera is unfortunately remaining off today because he does have some bandwidth issues, but we hope that he can show his face, if at least to say hello or say goodbye at the end. Outside of his work with the enterprise agility practice, James has also contributed to ITIL 4 quite significantly. Very notably in the high velocity IT practice, where he authored certain pieces on psychological safety and mental health for high velocity teams and for high velocity ITSM teams. He can be found on Twitter as @JimboFin, that's JIMBOFIN. So before we get started, to everyone, welcome. Thank you for taking part. Let's start by, sorry, go ahead. Go on, James.
Just from my perspective as well, I think the key thing is I go back to the pre-history of ITIL. So I'm hoping on this topic I'll bring a bit about ITIL archaeology into the picture.
Well, let's see how we get on. So, as I said, the genesis of this panel was a discussion we had on the Back to ITSM group around how do we classify things like near misses? Are they alerts? Are they events? Are they incidents? Are they problems? So I thought it would be good to start out by recapping some of these definitions. And let's perhaps maybe in a logical sequence. Let's start with alert. And Stuart, you were talking about alerts during the pre-conference warm-up. Would you like to go first and just talk very briefly about what alerts are?
Before I do that, actually, I'm actually going to suggest we start with event before we talk about alert, because ITIL says that an event is a change of state that has significance for the management of IT services. You may not know about an event, it's just something happened. The change of state doesn't have to be a radical transformational change of state. It could be that some piece of work has finished, or even that something has passed a threshold very gradually. After an event, you get to an alert, which is a notification that something has happened that may be of interest. So you can think of an event as being the input to your monitoring tools, and alert as being an output of your monitoring tools.
Fair enough. Phyllis, can I come to you for the next definition then? I suppose in the logical sequence of things, we have events which can lead to alerts, and some of those events and alerts might become incidents. So when we talk about the word incident, how would we go about explaining it or defining that?
Well, if I stick to, as close to the ITIL terminology as I can, an incident is a situation where something is not operating as expected. No longer service operations as our customers would expect them to be.
Right.
And, I look at it as that alert is kind of the forerunner to the incident if you're doing a really good job monitoring. You know about it before the service interruption starts driving calls to a service desk.
Mm-hmm. So I'll take the word problem, because I know that there's been a lot of confusion about what problem is. But don't worry, James, I'm going to come to you with possibly something that's near and dear to your heart after I define the problem. So a problem, there are a couple of nuances to the word problem, or to that definition. The first is an underlying cause of an incident or multiple incidents. But the nuance there is that the incident might not have actually occurred in the first place. So there can be situations where you acknowledge technical debt, you acknowledge a flaw that's been found in a third-party piece of software or equipment. The incident hasn't occurred yet. The conditions for that incident haven't occurred yet, but you can regard the situation, the alert that that third-party provider might have given you, or that your software development team might have written up about. You can regard that as a problem. It's a cause of an underlying incident. The other thing I'd like to mention when it comes to problems is that we've steered clear of talking about root causes of problems. We want people to be able to recognize that, root cause of incidents. We want people to be able to recognize that there may be different things that lead to incidents. Some of them could be technical, some of them could be systemic. And there's a really great analogy that I remember reading in a blog post by Don Reinertsen from Product Flow domain, which is, it's a bit of a macabre example, but let's say a canister of petrol blows up in your garage. Well, the spark that because of a faulty switch, let's say, the spark that led to that canister of gasoline or petrol blowing up, that was the technical incident. But then who made the decision to store that drum of petrol near that faulty spark, or with inadequate protections? That's a systemic cause that also contributed to that incident. So there are a couple of nuances with the definition of problem, or the explanation of that term problem in ITIL 4. But let's come to a couple of other very, very interesting terms that are certainly in use by the industry that we should talk about. And James, I'm going to come to you with this. Given that you've heard these definitions of alert and event and incident and problem, how would you explain, or how would you treat near miss? Because this is something that comes up quite a bit. Where would you place near miss in the grand scheme of things?
So it's complex. It's by surprise, and because I'm a consultant, it depends. Primarily for me, and I come from a background in risk management and in systems theory, near misses scare me almost more than things that actually happen. If you look at something like aviation industry, which is something, well, I'll come back to a few times in this podcast, we have something called tombstone imperative, which is basically people only deal with problems once a plane crashes and people die. But for all of us, I think, as people, would we rather things were dealt with before the plane crashed? As soon as we knew there was an issue or problem or a known error, as soon as an alert came up in the cockpit. So for me, yeah, a near miss is actually every bit as real as an actual thing happening. I think it's almost an arbitrary distinction between a near miss and a real miss. And somebody, probably Stuart, will remind me that Peter Brooks, the great guy, came up with a different term for near miss, which was quite powerful. But for me, yeah, a near miss is not there, but for the grace of God. For me, a near miss is really, really scary.
Stuart, do you know what that phrase was that James was referring to?
No, I've no idea what he's talking about.
Fair enough.
Surely not.
But James, you
I think
mentioned
he
the
might
word...
have called it a near hit, actually.
Yeah, I think that was it. I think that sums it up. You know, a near miss is you know, why didn't it happen? Very, very minor reasons, usually.
Can I add an observation to this whilst you're talking about this stuff? You were talking earlier about root causes and how there isn't a single root cause of most problems. Somebody, I think it was on the same back to ITSM discussion, but it might have been elsewhere recently, expressed it in beautiful language. They said, if I asked you what was the root cause of us having no incidents last week, you couldn't do it because we had to get lots and lots and lots of things right. It's the same with problems. There's lots and lots and lots of things you had to get wrong before something went wrong.
That's right. And I'd love to jump back into the near miss for a moment, because
Sure.
in systems and services, to me, a near miss means somewhere you're doing something right, as well as the possibility that if you didn't do it right one day, to James' point, you could have a very bad incident. So if I can see through monitoring and alerts that a situation is occurring and solve the situation before it becomes an incident, we'd call that a near miss. But would I want to do problem management around it? Well, if it was a plane, you certainly should be. Same thing with systems and services. If I have a near miss and I caught it before the system went down, and let's say that system powered a website, wouldn't it be nice that I caught it as a near miss, even though it was an almost hit? Better an almost hit than an actual hit. And if problem management lets us do that by looking at alerts, so be it. That's great.
And James, you also mentioned another keyword there, and perhaps I'll come to Stuart with this to sort of round off the definition phase of this discussion. You use the word risk, and some people might have used the word, let's say, colloquially, perhaps without necessarily knowing the definition and the reasoning behind the use of that word risk. So Stuart, can I come to you to round off this definition phase and talk about what is a risk and how does it relate to what we're talking about now?
A risk is an uncertain future event that may or may not happen. If you know it's going to happen, it's not a risk, it's an issue. And a risk is not necessarily a bad thing. If you're thinking about making an investment because you want to get a return on that investment, that is a risk. You may or may not get the good outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So so I guess I'm not trying to necessarily solve this for our audience. It depends, as James has said, but it feels like the near miss sort of sits more in the risk management or the problem management sphere. Would that be a fair thing to say, rather than incident management? Because incident management, most of the practitioners in our field tend to think of incident management very much as that reactive thing. It's the firefighting. Something's gone wrong. We've got to restore normal operations. We've got to restore value co-creation. A near miss signals that something may have gone wrong, but it doesn't feel like an incident. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I will caution one thing there, actually. And I think I might go out of the definition. You know, an incident might not actually happen because there might be something which happens in another organization which makes us think this could happen here. like a major outage due to an external hack. And that's still an incident, but we're talking about the potential impact of that, but we need to do problem management behind that to understand why we're vulnerable to it.
Sure, I can buy that.
Incidents don't always have to happen to scare us.
Right.
Can I share a little story with you about why it's really important to know whether you're dealing with an incident or a problem? Many years ago, I worked for a very large vendor that sold hardware and software and manufactured and all sorts. And we had a huge call center with thousands of people in it that took calls about, our equipment. And a customer who did know the difference between an incident and a problem phoned up and said, my Unix server has crashed and I need you to investigate it. And the person in our call center who did not know the difference between an incident and a problem treated this as an incident, checked that the server had rebooted, come up fine and closed the call. The customer was irate because they wanted the problem investigated. They knew they had a risk. If you don't know whether you're working on an incident or a problem, you can do the wrong thing.
That's right.
That's a fair point. But that story leads me to another question, which I know, Stuart, that we spent a fair amount of time talking about back in the days where we were creating ITIL for foundation guidance. A lot of people tend to think in going to V3 terminology and older terminology, that incident is about restoring the service, and problem management is about investigating why the incident occurred in the first place and fixing those underlying causes and so on. But as we work with modern technology, a lot of times we're actually resolving that or fixing that underlying cause when we're trying to restore an incident. It's not always the case, but it quite often is. We might have to write a new piece of code to replace a defective piece of code. And in doing so, we are actually fixing that underlying problem. And I know it led to a lot of debates back in the architecture days about whether we would term something like that incident management or problem management. If you cast your mind back, Stuart, do you recall how that discussion went?
Absolutely. The thing is, the way things were described in earlier versions of ITIL, people took away an incorrect understanding that each of the ITIL processes, as they were then, required a separate team and a separate queuing mechanism and a separate set of tools and a separate approach and a separate philosophy. As a direct result, something that went from being an incident to being a problem had to be passed between teams, had to be re-queued, had to be that was a disaster. The fact that you are doing both incident management and problem management while doing one thing as one person is not problematic. You can actually be doing service desk and incident management at the same time by doing a single thing. You can be doing service desk, incident management and problem management all at the same time, and continual improvement. They're different practices because they have different bodies of knowledge. They have different ways of thinking, different ways of prioritizing your work, and you need to understand the difference between them, but they don't have to involve handovers and queuing and different people. So it's not that important whether this millisecond, this particular screw that I'm tightening is incident management or problem management. It doesn't matter.
And I think, Stuart, you mentioned a really good thing about engagement. And I can think back to years and years ago when I ran a service desk and we had a problem that was a series of recurring incidents that we had not found root cause for, and how the problem management team would tell the service desk what specific information we could gather in order to help the problem management effort. So we had fully integrated service desk problem management, event management, and incident management. And those people on the service desk might not have known a thing about problem management. They just knew when this website white page happened, they had to find out the carrier, whether the person was dial-up or, DSL or whatever it was back in those days. They had to gather certain information and pass it along, and that was used by the problem management team looking for the root cause. So I think it's not as important. I agree. It's not as important what you call it, but that you're doing the work to get the permanent resolution.
Can I perhaps throw a slight challenge out to that? And I'll throw since Phyllis, I know you do a lot of work, especially on the toolset side of things as well, when you're advising customers. So maybe this is a good place to come in and say, a lot of toolsets distinguish between, for example, incident records and problem records. So there is a real life impact in that. Where are we going to put the information about what we did and what results that led to and what follow-up actions we need to have and so on. And, I'm sure we all have stories and perhaps even battle scars because we couldn't find the information that somebody else had keyed in previously because we were looking in the wrong place and so on. So I think I definitely agree with what you and Stuart have said. It's important to understand the difference, but it's not necessarily as important to say, well, right now I'm doing problem management, right now I'm doing incident. I agree with all that. But at the same time, there is a real life impact in that where is this information going to be captured and how do we want it captured? So how would you advise your customers and your clients about this sort of conundrum, if you will?
The analysis work and the record keeping, as you're talking about it, Akshay, I would put that in a problem record. Now, most service management tools today have incredible ability to relate records to one another. So every event or alert, every incident that happens can add information to that problem by being related to it with additional information so that you can troll through that information. Additionally, and this is the beautiful thing, many of the products now have some form of predictive intelligence or artificial intelligence that could also mine the system to alert you that, hey, you may have a problem on your hand. And then you can open that.
Stuart, I see your hand up.
Interestingly, I just wanted to share, I had one customer who insisted that every single incident on their system had an associated problem record on the grounds that every single incident had a cause that needed to be potentially understood. They didn't investigate most problems. They had a great method for prioritizing problems. And as soon as a problem bubbled up to a particular level, somebody would start investigating it. So they had lots of problems that they never investigated because so long as they were below priority 4 or whatever it was, they were ignorable. But it meant that they had all of the data they need and they had a structured way of distinguishing between somebody can't work and there's something going on that we haven't fully resolved. Worked very well for them.
James, I would like to come to you with that same question that I asked Phyllis, because I'd imagine that as part of your work with enterprise agility, there's or with agile teams and self-organizing teams, I'm sure there's a tension. I've spoken to a lot of organizations where this tension exists between this desire to have that centralized system of record, which can be mined for, as Phyllis said, for these trends and patterns that can help artificial intelligence tools and predictive analytics, versus self-organizing teams who want to also use the tools that they feel are the best for what they're trying to do. Is this an issue that or a friction that you find in the work that you're doing in enterprise agility?
I think to some degree it's an artificial distinction. One word I will come back to, and you have to see this word from an agile perspective, is backlog. Problem investigation, known error removal, incident management, they're all forms of backlog. They're activity people have to do to improve the value we're delivering to customers. And something, and we've not mentioned, but I think because of what we've said, very often problem management leads to change management. We know that. But I think that's how we have to place this. I think we then need to let people have some high-level direction, let's call it governance, about which of the problems they need to focus on, which ones are causing impact on the business, which could actually unleash more value for the business if they were dealt with. That needs to come probably from quite a high level. But how you go about doing that work? Do you work in a first in, first out model? How do you do that? I think that's for the individuals doing problem management to focus on. And the moment I said that, I think there's another distinction we need to make, which is forgotten about in ITIL too often. I'm not saying it's not in there. The difference between those people managing problems, orchestrating what we're doing in dealing with problems, versus the people who are actually doing the heavy lifting. And those people doing the heavy lifting more often than not have about 5 different day jobs, including implementing changes, running the system, blah, blah, blah. I think that's very key to understand. But for me, agile and problem management are very comfortable bedfellows.
So we do have a few questions that have come in, and I want to just pick up one of them rather than waiting for towards the end of the call, end of the discussion. I neglected to mention major incidents and major incident management, which is something that a lot of organizations treat as somewhat adjunct to the regular incident management activities. Traditionally, every major incident has kicked off a problem investigation, either whilst the incident is still active or as part of a post-incident review. Is that something that we still believe is fit for purpose? That approach, is that still fit for purpose in today's digital age, for lack of a better phrase? Charles, again with your enterprise agility hat, of course. I'll go through everyone, but since you were talking just now, I'll come back to you with that same question. So, is that major incident to problem synergy still something that is working today, or do we need to think of different approaches?
If a plane crashes tomorrow, who will probably be the second people to get access to the crash site? It will be the Civil Aviation Authority, it will be the Federal Aviation Authority, it will be the accident investigation people. Because when something happens today, it's more important than ever to understand why it happened. Now, what those people are trying to do is a lot more difficult than it used to be. But it's still absolutely relevant. And I would say, let's again at this point, go back to the definitions, just make three other quite important distinctions. The acute incident, the major incident, obviously has to be investigated. Why did this happen? But often that investigation will be part of the incident resolution as well. We also have the chronic problem, which is something low level, never quite attracts anybody's attention, but is costing the business a lot of money. And we have this very nebulous unicorn-like thing, which is proactive problem management, which is where we think about things which might happen. And I think problem management, one of the challenges, we have to keep an eye on all 3 of those. The need to do problem management in case of major incident has not gone away because we're in a different world.
Okay. Phyllis, I'll come to you with that same question. The sort of traditional link between major incident management and problem management, is that something that is still fit for purpose, or do we have to think about that link in different ways now?
Yeah, there's 2 aspects of this I'll talk about. One is the major incident to the problem. And again, from a business value perspective, if something large occurs, you've lost some form of revenue, whether it's productivity time internally or respect externally. If a system is down that's powers a website, you're going to lose respect, you're going to lose customers, you're going to lose revenue. So there's absolutely value in finding out why that happened in the first place. And even in the sense of a hardware repair, I might want to make sure that that piece of hardware doesn't have any known issues. And I could think of a hard drive replacement that happened way back in my dealership days, where they replaced a hard drive 5 times. And then they ran out of small hard drives. They replaced it the 6th time with a different model, and the problem went away. The next time a dealership lost the size drive that failed at that first dealership, we asked the vendor to replace it with the second run. And we later, in problem management, found out that the manufacturer had a run of bad hard drives. And they were now acknowledging they had that, so we could go proactively to every dealership that had that model and replace it. So looking at the business value of that, you're looking at tremendous value across 285 dealerships, even if 25 of them only had the bad hard drive. We've stopped an incident from occurring in those dealerships based on the problem management work. So absolutely, you want to investigate the big ones. We also had a process for the minor incidents, those things that happen to 100 people a day. And we called that our top 10. And what we would do is we would look at all incidents that fell in the top 10 of the calls that we took each day and say, do any of those deserve to be escalated in problem management? And again, the business value wins out, right? Because if it's taking people 20 minutes to log in the morning and it should take 2, and we investigate that, we find the root cause, we fix it, and the value to the business is restored. So we looked at it both ways. Major incident ended up in problem management to find out the why, and anything that was big enough on a minor incident level wound up in problem management to find out the why. So I think as long as you're demonstrating that business value, you keep going.
So Stuart, it sort of feels like both James and Phyllis are also suggesting a recontextualization of what it means to have a major incident. So it's not just about that single sharp shock, although it could be that single sharp shock, but it could also be an accrual of value loss, if you will, over a large scale that can also be regarded as a major incident. Is this something that you've been sort of advising your clients on in recently?
As you know, actually, I like to tell stories.
Of course.
I worked as a problem manager once, and we had a solution that was very unreliable. It was causing many outages, lots of loss of value to the client. It was a big deal. It was a major problem. There were incidents multiple times a week. Now, the techie IT people had spent ages doing root cause analysis in their individual teams, the software team. This was some solution that had hundreds of servers in many different layers with loads of applications at different levels of middleware and software and clients. You can imagine the sort of thing. What's interesting is, as we were getting towards the bottom of it, it turned out there were 7 or 8 clearly distinct problems. Some of them were to do with software design, some of them were to do with infrastructure architecture. There were about 8 absolutely distinct problems. We could characterize each one in terms of, we came up with a way of recognizing them. We came up with workarounds for each of them. Each of them turned into a different known error. From the customer's point of view, there was one problem. The service wasn't reliable. Now, we made a decision not to thrust in front of the customer that we thought this was 7 different problems, because they didn't care. So what we actually ended up doing was having a hierarchy of problems. We had 7 technical problems linked into one business problem. Why do I tell you this story? Because I think we have to understand our problems from the point of view of our customers. We have to understand everything that we do from the point of view of our customers. The customer doesn't care that we've got 7 or 8 or 43 different problems. The customer cares that the service is unreliable. Now that brings us all the way back into what James was saying earlier about managing backlogs and prioritizing work. You can have, how do you prioritize? Well, you've got to look at each of these techie problems and say, how painful is this one compared to the other 6? Which are we going to focus on right now on fixing? It all becomes quite interesting, and it takes us all the way back to another thing that's new in ITIL 4, value streams. Let's get away from prioritizing problems and prioritizing incidents and prioritizing. Let's look at what are the value streams and what work is important to our customers and focus there.
It's interesting because I can see in the YouTube chat, I've been being fed some of the questions, and in fact, Dan Breston just chimed in to say, would there be a better flow of work if, instead of concentrating on concepts of incident or problem, we actually look at the flow of activities to get to a status that we're happy with. Yeah. But at the same time, I will throw a slight challenge to that, to the group here, which is, and I think James alluded to that. As organizations, as managers in organizations, we have a constraint. We have a finite amount of resource, whether that's time, people's energy, skills, whatever it might be. There are actual constraints within which we need to be able to work. And to an extent, the attributing things to incidents versus problems, etc., helps us prioritize the work that we're asking our teams to do. So, for example, in some cases, a problem might be a higher priority than a current and active incident. Equally, sometimes we could say that the problem is low level. It's not leading to enough of a value loss, and we need to be able to fix the things that are going on right now, or perhaps we need to focus on creating new features for the service, whatever it might be. So I buy into the concept of visualization and value streams and flow, but it also feels like we still need to be able to, in some ways, prioritize appropriately. And in that case, sometimes the definitions help us understand the difference between what is the goal of the activity. And James, I see your hand went up a few moments ago. So, and since you talked about the prioritization conundrum, I'll come to you with that question. How do we prioritize if we're looking at things from a flow perspective?
So again, I'm back to concept. There is one flow. There is one backlog of work. And whether or not we decide to fix a problem or even investigate a problem or put in a new feature, we're judging it against the same criteria. How much effort will it take? How much value will we get out of it? And we have to get the ITIL processes out of these very hairy swim lines. That's sort of, that's hard for me to say, because for the first 10 years, back in 1990, that I was involved with ITIL, we were trying to put things into swim lanes. But I think now's the time to start saying that maybe isn't overall productive. I'll say two other things. One of the most important things the problem manager can do is say, no, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to waste time and resources sorting out this problem because the overall impact is not high enough. And not enough problem managers have the guts or the authority to say that. And the moment you start doing that, you become a real problem manager, in my humble opinion, which maybe isn't that humble. And the third thing I'll say is to link back to what Stuart said, the really important problems don't impact just one major instance or one system. How often have we looked at the root cause and discovered that part of it might, that the testing regime was not as good as it could have been for that system? Surely the question which then raises our mind is not how do we move testing for that individual system, but how do we improve our entire regime of testing across every system that we introduce into the live environment? And I think the moment that light bulb goes on, and I just saw Stuart's thumbs up there, I think, again, that's when you become a real problem manager.
A few months ago, James, I had a dripping tap in my bath. So I opened up the tap and swapped over the tap washer. And I was just about to say job done and go downstairs. And I thought, do you know what? I bet the other tap's worn as well, because they both get used just as much. And sure enough, I opened up the tap next to it and that was worn too. And I replaced that one at the same time. It's not hard, is it?
So there
isn't.
Go ahead, James.
But it is. That's the trouble, Stuart. We know this is simple. I mean, I remember the early ITIL courses, which are very much case study based. We took people for a help desk study, and underlying it all was that you needed problem management. Problem management in the early days was probably the most important process. The concept is simple, but making it happen in an organization is incredibly hard.
So I just want to pull on this thread a little bit, and since we're all telling stories, I'll perhaps extend Stuart's analogy a little bit. I would like to liken I will liken the modern enterprise more to a block of flats, right? Different people but they're all part of the same sort of ecosystem, but they're all doing different things. Some some common activities, etc. You're the plumber, you come in and you realize that the washer and the taps in apartment 1A are faulty and you fix them. Does that then give you the remit, the authority to go to flat 2A or flat 3F and start changing the washers on all the taps? Right? That is the reality of modern enterprises as well, that even though we may have the responsibility, the duty of care to go ahead and change something in a particular area as part of a particular team, it doesn't necessarily give us the authority to then be able to say, well, we now need to review everything. Is that a situation that has presented itself, and how would you advise the listeners that we have, the audience that we have, on navigating some of those discussions? Phyllis, I'll come to you first with that.
Perfect. And, you know, I'm going to throw in another process. So in our problem management process, we had a gate that was basically, you know, we're at the point where we're ready to fix something, or we know what the problem is, we know what the fix will cost. Now we're opening a request for change and evaluating, is the value of doing the repair worth it versus experiencing the incident? And I'll tell another story because, you know, we're all doing the stories, right? There was one issue we had that was identified as a memory leak, a piece of code that was bad. We were able to band-aid it in a way that the users never felt an impact. And we said, do we really need to do line-by-line code analysis to find the piece of code that's causing a memory leak, which will take hours and hours of developer effort, and then fix the code and test the code for something that we can band-aid with a monitoring system that has absolutely no impact? So I'm going to give the steward, it depends. You know, we really have to bring the processes together and understand that if it's a very high-end community, and I'm going to lose my place as a high-end community if I don't fix that problem across all the flats, people are paying a lot of rent. They're going to be angry, why didn't I do it? If it's a lower value community, you know, middle class, not so high-end, maybe I'm going to wait till people call me. So you have to look at the value, the cost, and make a judgment. And that's not necessarily on the team that's able to solve the problem. It may be a bigger decision in many organizations. And again, it could be driven by cost. If cost is above a certain amount, it's going to take more inquiry than if it's a routine thing.
Can I pick up actually on tying something that Phyllis just said with something that James was saying earlier? The way we prioritize problems and backlogs, one of my customers had a very, very sophisticated method for prioritizing problems, which included looking at the effectiveness of any workarounds they had, such that once there was an effective workaround in place, they generally didn't bother, even if they didn't understand the root cause. If the workaround was effective, we don't know where the memory leak is, we don't care. That's fine.
Yeah.
But you've got to have quite sophisticated ways of measuring and understanding the impact. And that gets you all the way back to what James was saying before. You've got one backlog. Why would you spend a lot of time investigating that memory leak when there's a new feature that's going to generate a lot of value that people are waiting for? Well, maybe there is a good reason, maybe there isn't, but you need to be able to have that discussion at that level of sophistication.
That's a fair point. And actually, that does bring me to another question that came in, I think, over on LinkedIn, because somebody was asking how we would look at incidents, problems, alerts, etc., and how we would tie that to observability, the concept of observability in site reliability engineering, which, if I remember correctly, observability was the ability to be able to understand what was going on inside a system by observing what was happening outside of that system boundary. And how the concept of observability in SRE ties to our service management concepts of event management and incident management. I think there's strong correlations. I mean, I'm probably going to be crucified for saying this, but I think that SRE is a beautiful example of service management principles and techniques working together in a highly scaled infrastructure and digital environment. I mean, you can look at certain things like observability and saying that's how event management and alerting and incident management can all come together to be able to create a specific outcome. But I'd be interested to know what others have to, if there's any other comments on that. Who'd like to go first? James, I can't see your hand go up, but if you'd like to chime in, please do say.
Yeah, I'm going to. Schrodinger's cat, or Terry Pratchett's take on those of you who aren't familiar with Schrodinger's cat concept, but there's this cat in a box where whether it lives or dies is based on quantum events which are themselves observable. And Terry Pratchett's view was that actually there's three possible states of that cat when you open the box: alive, dead, or furious. And I think we run this problem, but the whole SRE observability view of the world depends on a non-quantum, non-complex worldview. In my old mainframe days, yes, I knew a merry event actually meant what the knock-on effect. I just don't think we're in that world anymore. And we're I think the world that many of us work in now, we just have to recognize God does indeed play dice. And problem management has to work with the fact that we're essentially gambling a lot of the time.
Fair enough. Stuart, I see you have your hand up.
Whilst I agree with what James said, I do think that as service management professionals, as software developers, as hardware engineers and architects, we have a responsibility to our clients to build in the instrumentation, the monitoring to make that observability work for them. That if we build black boxes and they fail, that's our fault.
That's a fair point. I'll move on to another question, which I think came in from Caspar. And he asked if there was any thoughts that we had on continual improvement and problem management. And I'll extend that one step further, thinking around how problem management, risk management, and continual improvement work together. Because, I mean, I've been involved with ITIL since day zero. I am still of the opinion that problem management and continual improvement are two techniques of risk management, because your problems are investigating risks and fixing risks before they can become issues. Or they take issues and mitigate any residual risk from those incidents. And they can lead to, or the philosophy of continual improvement is yet another way of empowering your teams to be able to say, where do the risks currently lie? And how can we mitigate the risks that we currently have in our environment? So for me, I understand the difference in the terminology. I understand how they're different. But for me, the three of them are very, very closely tied together, which in some ways is slightly different from the V3 view of risk management, where risk was something that was tackled in the service design phase, and it was about availability and capacity and infosec and continuity. So for me, problem management, continual improvement, risk management, they're all part of that same toolkit. Anyone want to debate me on this? Well, Stuart's nodding his head vigorously.
I was just going to say, I find it very difficult, and I wonder about the value of it when you try to peel one process off from another. You could argue that that top 10 process we had was really about continual improvement in our service to our customers. Or you can argue that it's problem management. And you can always say, if I'm lowering the impact of a potential issue, it's always going to be risk management. So does it matter if you try to carve those things out, or is part of the beauty of ITIL the fact that all the practices work together to deliver an intended outcome and value to the customer?
That's a great point for this.
I think this is a fabulous place for us to be nearly at the end of our discussion, because I think we're all going to violently agree here. Some of my customers treat all of the bad things that might happen as risks, and all of the good things that they'd like to happen as improvement opportunities. They're all risks. I don't care. They use slightly different ways of prioritizing, slightly different ways of managing, slightly different ways of budgeting. They have a continual improvement register with good things they want to happen. They have a risk register with bad things they want not to happen. Other people I know treat them all as risks. Some people carve off the techie ones and call them problems. It doesn't matter. So long as you consistently address things, and so long as you manage your backlog in a way that means that you're investing in the things that make a difference and that you're not investing in the things that don't make a difference, is good stuff.
That's true.
Arose by any other name.
Yeah.
Well, a problem by any other name. That's precisely the title.
There we are.
So we have come full circle. So we've got about 5 minutes left before I'm going to wrap this up. And we do have some more questions that are coming from the live audience. And I'm just going to pick a couple of them. I think we've addressed this one, but Byron asks whether root cause analysis is something that should fall with the incident management team or should wait for post-incident or should fall within the remit of problem management. I think that's a really tricky one to answer because it really depends on the nature of the incident.
Actually, if Byron had done the V1 Service Managers exam, he would recognize the key question in Dave's the old essays. Do the objectives of incident management and problem management contradict each other? And I think Phyllis has sort of answered that. We have to see them working in concert together.
As I said, I think it's a difficult question to answer because there will be some cases where in order to be able to restore normal service, you have to figure out what's actually gone wrong first, and to in some cases correct that or overwrite that. And in some cases, you may actually be fixing an underlying technical flaw in order to restore normal service.
I will qualify it, though, actually, to say that root cause analysis in and of itself is just a technique that we use, which often is of negative value. Ivan McFarlane tells this lovely story about a friend of his who had a leak from under their concrete floor in their kitchen, a gas leak. They called in the emergency gas fitter, who simply cut off the pipe that goes under the kitchen and temporarily ran a pipe around the outside of the house to come in behind the cooker. The next week, they called in the structural engineer to find out where the leak was. And the structural engineer said, "You really want me to dig up the whole concrete floor of your kitchen when you've already got a fix?" Right. You don't have to do root cause analysis if you don't have to do it. It's a technique that you may or may not want to use.
Fair enough. I will also point out, as I mentioned earlier, that with ITIL 4, we've tried to move away from the language of calling something a root cause, and that you can do cause analysis, you can do fault analysis, but you wouldn't do root cause analysis because you might find the technical causes, you might not be addressing the structural causes, the systemic causes. Looking at some of the other questions, we talked about major incident management for a bit. We've talked about, James has talked about some of the issues we have when prioritizing problems. And I think it comes back to how much value are we going to get out of, prioritizing a problem over prioritizing a feature fix over prioritizing a change or whatever. It really depends on how we can optimize the flow of value. But somebody from Kite Technology Solutions has chimed in with another question along the same lines, which is, how would you approach problem management when the problem is fixed by something other than a live incident, such as a change going in poorly, which hasn't affected production yet? So would you, I mean, these debates do occur. Is that failed change still something that's a responsibility of the change? I don't want to use the word change team because often it's the same team that's doing all these different things. But should that be tackled as part of the change management flow of activities, or is that something that we've got to change what hat we're wearing, as it were, and tackle it with a different hat? James, you've talked about this one backlog concept, so I'd like to come back to you with this question. So if there is a bad change, should that be tackled as part of the normal change management or change enablement timeline? Or should that be paused until, or that investigation be paused until we have resources that are free to come back as part of problem investigation?
So, I mean, again, let's go back to early days. Something we realized in problem management very early on is that 80% of problems, I'm making that percentage up, come from change management going wrong. But it's simply that there's a synergistic relationship between these two things. What we do have to realize is that when a change goes wrong and causes a problem, it makes us suspect So it's a systematic problem of change management. Something is going wrong in how changes are tested, how they're specified, or something like how they're evaluated. So we just need to make this link between these processes. And as I've said several times before, stop making these artificial distinctions. Who does it help?
Stuart.
There is one distinction that I think is worth making, and I think it's worth making because we forget the important one otherwise. We need to distinguish between doing the work and improving how we do the work. Because so many organizations just focus on doing the work and forget the bit where you stand back and say, how could we do it better? And for me, that's a distinction between is that change management, or that's improving how you do the work. I don't care what you call it, but you have to do it.
That's a good one.
And culturally, Stuart, that's an interesting question, isn't it? About what is the role of the problem manager? Is somebody who's telling people they're doing things wrong, or is it a real enabler for change?
Yeah.
I'll do one more question before I wrap this up, because I really hate the fact that sometimes our audience feels like we've ignored their question, but there are a lot of really good questions, and perhaps we'll do a follow-up to this discussion. But I'll try with one last question, and Phyllis, I'll come to you with this one. Seeger asks, if we have problem tickets which we require a lot of investigation, etc., should we keep problem records open? And for how long should we keep problem records open? I think this is more on the, not necessarily the administration side, but I can also see how, on a report, suddenly you start to see the number of open problems starting to rise, and people start saying, well, why are they rising? But individually, a single problem might not warrant the degree of investigation. So how would we treat these records? What sort of bookkeeping advice would you give Seeker?
I'm going to start to do that wrap up, right? There's the backlog, which is in the backlog because it's a low priority, little value lost as a result of that problem. And then there's the comment that was made earlier about you have a real change manager. Very often I find problems remain open because we've done the investigation, but we're not ready to move forward with the fix. So if they're open, you have one of two scenarios. Either they're so low priority that you're not going to deal with them, and you might at a certain point say, they're so low priority that we're going to make a business decision to close it, as they've had some investigation done, but they're just not a priority to the organization. You can always reopen it if something changes. These are too expensive to fix versus the value lost. And we're going to assume the risk, and we're going to close them saying we're not going to fix them because of the expense. We have an effective Band-Aid. And I think in all of those cases, it comes back to what Stuart's been saying about risk management. On every problem, you should have a decision. Am I accepting the risk and closing it? Am I accepting the risk and leaving it open? Or am I going to fix it? And at what level of priority am I going to do that fix? So again, we're coming full circle of bringing everything back to value. And it's not the length of the list. It's the priority order in which that list is being handled, and getting things off the list that don't require attention.
Absolutely. I will also like to plug a couple of other concepts, error control and problem control. We don't necessarily have the time to go into that right now, but on the My Axelos on the My Axelos section of the Axelos website under My ITIL, you will find all the practice publications there. There's a great wealth of knowledge on problem management, problem control, error control, how that ties into continual improvement, how it ties into risk management, and all the other practices that we have described in ITIL 4. So if you've taken an ITIL exam in the last 2 years, I think, you should have received an email giving you 1 year's access to My ITIL, where you can find all this information for free. If you haven't seen that email, do reach out to ask@axelos.com to find out how you can get your subscription activated. As I said, it's a fabulous wealth of resources, and I encourage people to take a look at that. So it just leaves me to thank everyone for giving us an hour of their time today. Phyllis, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Your day is only just getting started out there in Florida. And James and Stuart, you're closer to home. I hope you have a lovely afternoon. All of us can be found on Twitter. I'm @Blowboy. Phyllis is Miss ITSM, that's MS ITSM. Stuart is @StuartRance. James is @JimboFin. but you can also find us on various other social media platforms. And once again, I'd just like to plug back to ITSM. It's a fabulous forum, a fabulous resource for more information to anyone who has even a passing interest to IT service management. You can find that on Facebook. So to all our audience and to our lovely panel, I hope you all stay safe and please wash your hands.
Thank you.
Thank you, Akshay.